Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by Jelson Delgandio. He is an expert on vibes and communication. And today we're going to talk about the vibes, what it all means, and how we feel that out for ourselves, how we experience that in the world. Um, I don't know a ton about it yet, but that's why we do these things to find out more. So welcome, Jason, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Hi, Cameron. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yes, why don't you start us off by explaining a little bit about your website, what you do, so we can learn, and then we'll learn more as we ask questions.
Sure. I'll start from the beginning, just to make sure your listeners and viewers know who I am. So, like you said, my name is Jason Delgandio. I'm a college professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. And at Temple University, my expertise is the theory and practice of social justice, with a focus on activism and social movements. In other words, I study how human beings create social change. However, outside of Temple and outside of, let's say, my college work, my other expertise, as you said, is the vibe or vibes in the plural. Right. Now that sounds like a strange topic to some people. Like, how the hell do you study a vibe? What are you, some kind of crazy hippie? All these kinds of things. Right. But I've been studying vibes since I was in my late teens. So at this point, it's probably about 30 years. Right. And I approach the vibe as a site of intellectual investigation. Right. I don't claim to be a new age healer or a wellness movement expert or anything like that. Right. That's not really not what I do. Instead, I'm a thinker. I'm a philosopher. I'm a teacher. I'm an activist, and I'm intrigued by this phenomenon that we call the vibe, right? And so one of the most basic ways I can define the vibe is the exchange of energy between you and other people. So again, the exchange of energy between you and other people. Now, of course, so the question becomes, what is the nature of this energy, right? So a lot of times the word energy and word vibe are interchangeable, right? So then we have to investigate, like, what are we saying about this energy? So for instance, is this energy physical or metaphysical? Is it spiritual or scientific? Is it material or immaterial? Or perhaps it's all these things all at the same time. Now, to give your listeners and yourself some examples of what I'm talking about here, think of a first date. So you go on a first date, and one of the ways you evaluate that first date is whether or not you have a connection with the other person, right? And a lot of times that connection, though, can translate into a vibe between you and the other person. And of course, we all kinds of vibes, right? So perhaps the date is actually horrible. It went nowhere. You never want to see this person again, and so on and so on and so on. So we'd say, well, that's a bad vibe, right? Or maybe you got along with the other person, you enjoyed your time together, but it was more platonic, more of a friendship vibe, right? Or maybe there was a romantic vibe there, right? And you're evaluating that interaction with each other based on this thing that we call the exchange of energy. Another kind of example, think of going to a musical concerts. And perhaps you're there with 100 fans, 1,000 fans, 5,000 fans, and you're all rocking out, all jamming to the same music, right? And you're feeling the energy of the crowd, you're feeling the energy of the band, and that's part of the overall collective experience within that environment. The same thing can be said for sports. So you're at a sports stadium and you're there with 20,000, 50,000, 80,000 fans. You're all screaming together and you feel the electricity in the crowd, right? Pick whatever sport you want, football, baseball, basketball, but it's the end of the game. You're down by a couple of points. Your team needs to score to win. All of a sudden you do it and the entire place goes crazy, right? And you feel that actual energy happening inside the stadium. You feel it inside your body. You look around, you can see other people are feeling it, and so on. Another example, different kind of example. Think about an intense, heated argument with your family members or your close friends, right? And you feel that tension, you feel the unease, and the relationship is off for a certain amount of time between you and whoever you're arguing with. And the same thing can be said, let's say, in a work meeting. You go to a work meeting, the boss is upset, something's wrong, and you can cut the tension with a knife. And the collective mood in that room is something that you all refer to again, evaluate that experience, right? And so those are some snapshots of when a lot of people might use this phrase, the vibe, or some form of the vibe, vibrations, vibing, vibed out, all that kind of stuff.
All right, fair enough. Well, good. That's a nice jumping off point. So, um, what can we do with, I mean, I think we all kind of feel it and know about it. What do we do with that knowledge? How
Right.
can what can we change things, shift things, change how we are? What do we do with this knowledge?
Excellent question. And there's the quick answer is all kinds of things we can do with it, right? One of the things that I try to focus on with my work, so my latest project is called 20 Minute Vibe. People go check it out on the website. It's 20minutevibe.com. One of the things I'm trying to do there is to help people articulate their experience of the vibe in a way that makes sense for them personally. Right. And so I give different kinds of definitions, all kinds of examples. And so how might we turn the experience into an idea? And I say that because once it's an idea, now you have more control over it. Right. Another way of putting that is how do we take a subconscious experience and make it a conscious thought? Right. Now, one of the ways to become more aware of vibes is to become more aware and have intent here. So be more aware of your body in space, be more aware of your surroundings, and be more aware of the people around you. The reason why I begin with awareness is that if you're always up here in your head and all this psychological clutter is going on, right, that kind of cuts you off to everything else that's going on in the world. You're like literally inside your head, right? So try to focus on, again, your body, your surroundings, and other people. And then from there, um, try to distinguish between, let's say, intuition, emotions, and vibe, or vibes in the plural. When I say intuition, a lot of times that word is used in spiritual practice or in new age circles, etc., which is totally fine, right? But it doesn't have to be. I think we all are intuitive creatures to one degree or another. When I say intuition, in the words, your subconscious mind is more aware about what's happening in your environment than your conscious mind. So when we say your conscious mind, it's like literally where you're focusing your attention, right? But that focus is like a little peephole. All the rest of the world is still happening, right? But then your subconscious mind is not focused on that one little point, but rather is connected to the rest of the environment. So intuition is allowing your subconscious mind to communicate or interact with your conscious mind. Right? Then emotions, on the other hand, are psychological responses or psychological reactions to a set of circumstances. And those circumstances can be real or perceived. Right? Something happens and you have an emotional reaction, right? Happiness, sadness, grief, fear, love, romance, etc. Then we get to the vibe, though. It's similar to these two things of an intuition and emotion, but not necessarily the same. Right. So again, for me, I try to approach the vibe as its own phenomenon and its own category of experience. And so from there, the question is, well, once we have this knowledge, what you're asking, right? What do we do with it? Right. Well, um, you can use a vibe to attract people. You can use the vibe to intimidate people. You can use vibes to be more charismatic. You can use vibes literally as a form of communication, not necessarily in the sense of, the precision of language and talking, but you catch a vibe from someone walking down the streets, right? And so then how do we develop those experiences into more a more conscious way of using the vibe, I guess.
Yes, well, this has always been a bit confusing for me because I am autistic, but I have a trauma background. So I have a great sense of the mood of the room and people and all this type of thing, but I also miss a ton. And I'm the last to find out about anything. Like everyone will know two people are sleeping together, and I'm kind of like had no idea, had no clue, how would I know? Um, so if you're in, those of us who are neurodivergent and just you're sending out signals, our transmitters are not on.
Mm,
In fact, they're not even installed in many cases.
right.
What are some things to look for?
That's a really good question. I'll frame it in this way that I have a really close friend. Her name's Jen, who was recently diagnosed with autism, and she's, I guess, in her early 40s, something like that, right? And it was really life changing for her in a positive way. And she knows about my work with the vibe and whatnot. We've been talking about this, right? She's into the vibe, things like that. One of her questions was like, "Well, autistic people experience the vibe." I was like, "Well, I don't know. Like, I'm not autistic, so I can't speak for other people." Um, but it may be a different way of experiencing the vibe, right? And I would say that there are 8 billion people on the face of the planet, and all 8 billion people experience the world in a different kind of way, right? I'll argue that to my death. There's no doubt about that, right? Then when it comes to the vibe, though, it's like, well, I don't know. Like, I would have to ask other people, like, do you understand, like, what the framework that I'm setting up? And do you see it that way? Do you experience it that way, etc.? Right? I'm kind of I'm not directly answering your question. I'm kind of like we're trying to have a conversation here. So I would ask you, based on things I've said so far in the first 5 minutes here, does it resonate with you? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? Do you experience the world through vibes or not? And if the answer is no, that's totally fine. I'm not offended. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I'm totally open to
Mhm.
wherever we go with this.
No, no, no. I mean, I do to a point,
Okay.
I think is the problem. I mean, I think it's easier because I obviously spent a lot of time in these sorts of circles. I think it's easier to almost not know anything. Because for me, it's like I have the worst of both possible worlds. I can tell stuff, but I can't do anything with the information. I don't know. I'm missing half the picture. It's like looking at a painting and bits of it have been covered over
Interesting.
in gesso, and you can't. It's like there's a painting there, you have some ideas on what it might be, but nothing defined.
Hmm.
um and so that oftentimes, and here's where the autism comes back in, this often leads to a lot of like social social faux pas, because you think things
Hmm.
are going in one direction and they're not, or you're trying to follow the rules, but people have unconsciously, without saying a word, decided not to, um, because the mood has changed. Like I heard this is not my story, but I heard a story one time, um, where he was in the kindergarten. They were supposed to doing this little pageant production sort of thing. And at the end, they're all supposed to hold out their candles as sort of a great finisher. And for some reason, no one knew why, um, the other children didn't decide to do it. But of course, he did because that was what you were supposed to do. That
Right.
was the rule. That was what was rehearsed. But everyone else, without saying a word, just decided not to. And so there he was holding his candle out like he was supposed to. Um, and everyone's wondering why he's doing that because no one else is doing it.
Hmm.
Like, how do you, I mean, obviously there was a vibe shift,
Right.
sort
Okay.
of thing. And it's like, what do you do with it? Because, like, in the autistic mind, it's like, if it's not spoken out loud, if it's
Hmm.
not directly, and this is going to lead to my next question. If it's not spoken out loud, if it's not directly addressed, for a lot of us, you didn't say anything. Why would we care? Why would we
Right.
care? Why would we concern ourselves? You didn't say anything. Um, and and that's kind of where I go with my next question of in terms of like being able to sort of, figure out how to navigate the better, or even, or perhaps this is the better question. How do, how does this, how can people have a vibe shift and have this unconscious communication without actually communicating? How does that work? It's like magic, you know? No, I'm not very seriously.
Yeah.
I'll tell one on myself. I at dear friends, and the husband was like being like saying a lot of very like overtly like gay and homosexual stuff. And I kind of thought he was like, maybe, interested. And I could totally see that they're like longtime friends. I'm kind of a known quantity sort of thing. If one is going to do that sort of thing, might as well, stick it close to home sort of
Right.
thing. Completely missed the actual intention.
Right.
It's not, I didn't miss the boat. I wasn't at the dock, like sort of thing. Um, I was at the airport looking for a boat. And
That's a great metaphor. I'm going to steal that. It's a great metaphor.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. And so it's just like it's like, how does this like silent communication works? Autists of the country want to know.
All right, so I want to be as honest as possible. It's like I am not in any way an expert on autism. I'm not. Like I don't want to speak out of turn in any way,
I'm
right?
not expecting you to
Right.
be.
But in just listening to your stories and what you're saying, right, there's a challenge in reading, let's say, the nonverbals, not like actual nonverbal communication of other people, right? Hand
Right.
gestures, body language, things like that, right?
Yeah.
The vibe is different than that. Though, like it's all part of the package deal of being human, but there may be the possibility that understanding vibes could be helpful for those who are autistic. And I don't know if that's true enough. That is a possibility. Like rather than just reading the nonverbals, if you can intuitively feel the vibrational exchange between you and other people, that might be more helpful than looking for the nonverbal cues. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, for instance, if we talk about people who are just perpetual liars, right? They just lie all
Mm-hmm.
the time, right? they try to lie to you through what they say, so their linguistic content, as well as through their nonverbals, right? Using their eye contact, hand gestures, a pat on the back to make you trust them, etc. But if you are attuned to the vibe, you can pick up on the fact that they're lying to you. Like all their nonverbals and the linguistic content says one thing, but the exchange of energy between you and the other person is saying something else. I personally tend to trust my intuition or my vibe or the vibe more than the language or the nonverbals because I think it's more honest, right? It's harder to control the vibe you're giving off than it is with the words you're using or your nonverbals, right? And so perhaps there could be a lot of research to do there. I don't know for sure, but there could be some interesting, let's say, progress there in terms of the relationship between learning about the vibe and those with autism. Again, I'm speculating here. I don't know, but there's a possibility there.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, that's very good. That's very good. I know. I think I think also let's take it in the reverse direction.
Okay.
Um, and this is I'm okay at this, others are better. Particularly I find women with autism are better at this. Um, Although I'm sure that's not universally true, but I've noticed that there are few seem to report that. Um, there seems to be this very odd thing where autistic people will notice something, um, a vibe, a feeling, a mood, all this sort of thing, and people get absolutely viscerally angry when you actually verbalize it and address it.
Interesting.
Um, and so let's have a scenario. Um, I am walking into a room of people and I can immediately tell there is tons of tension. I have a friend who would go around each person and be able to tell you exactly what they're feeling. I'm not that good.
Yeah,
She's
yeah.
much better at it. Um, and be able to tell you each person's mood, all this sort of thing. And if you notice it but don't say anything, it's fine. But and this is particularly true in like work environments
Yeah.
when you say, okay, so do we just all hate Steve and why? People are like, oh my God, how could you say that? You're awful. And it becomes about you. It's kind of like we all can feel it. It's so obvious. Why is it like verboten to say the unspoken thing? This makes no sense to us. Like it's there, let's talk about it,
Yeah.
sort of thing. So what, like, why do people get angry when nonverbal communication crosses into verbal communication?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. That's an awesome question. And just what quickly off the top of my head, I think there are certain kinds of quote unquote social norms in which we can all know something, we can all feel it, experience it, but it's a no-no to actually talk about it. I like the experience or the example of being in the workforce. That's definitely true in the workforce, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
But I think even in the whole, vibes thing, I feel like if there is a vibe in a place and you decide to because you're moving from one type of communication to another
right.
and you
Mhm.
decide to directly address it, it's going to get usually a not great reaction from people. And I think that's very interesting.
No, I agree. Now, as someone who has my degrees in communication studies, I would say something along the lines of um, it's not always what you say, but also how you say it. So
Mm.
if we're all feeling this thing in the room, but no one's actually wanting to talk about it, it doesn't mean you can't talk about it. But how do you frame it? What is your word choice? How do you soften the blow, so to speak? Should you be more blunt or more subtle about it, etc.? And I think that would be helpful in terms of negotiating and mitigating those kinds of awkward situations, right? So it's
Well,
not
and,
just
and
that
le-
you
and
brought
let's
it
face
up,
the
but
fact, most autistic people have all the subtlety of a sledgehammer on a lot of this
I
stuff.
was as I was saying that was going right. That's part of the issue, right? That's part of the
Yeah.
dynamic here. Yeah.
Yeah, we just
Uh,
kind of come out and be kind of like, so this is fucked up, sort of, and everyone's just kind of like, oh no, you're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to, and it's kind of like, but it is. Like, can we
right.
just be
Yeah.
like, can we be honest? I think that's where so many autistic people struggle with this sort of nonverbal communication is that like, and I think that's because we live in our heads. For us, if it's not a thought, a feeling, or something that can be quantified and
Mhm.
articulated, it basically doesn't exist for us because we
Interesting.
don't have that system. It
Hmm.
wasn't installed. Like we
Right.
were in the corner playing one day. It was not a factory option. They were trying to save money, like, all this sort of thing. And so for us, it's like we have, it's like if we're feeling this, we're not just going to be kind of like, oh, the vibe. We're going to be kind of like, oh, I'm experiencing this. And we're like, and especially for a lot of us, I mean, if you're nonverbal, you're off the hook. But for those of us that are, we're gonna want to, it's like saying, and I always say I was the kid who says the emperor has no clothes. This
Right.
does not make me a popular person, as you can imagine. And I think that's a very common experience. And so when we start talking about vibes and non-communication, the moods in group and how groups of people act and all this type of thing, um, I always from my experience at a personal level, I always end up experiencing it as an outsider. I have never felt part of a group my entire life. No matter
Interesting.
how big the group is or how small, if there's more than one other person, it's always, I never really kind of feel like I fit in. So I look at all of this stuff, and this is kind of why I find what you do fascinating, is I look at all of this from the outside.
Hmm.
That's why I always joke I'm an alien researcher from another planet studying the bipedal primates on this one, but my mothership forgot me and now I'm just here taking notes unnecessarily. Um, like so I look at it from the outside. And so I guess the perspective I'm looking at from you is what is it like to experience a vibe and group cohesion as part of the group? What is that like? 'Cause
Interesting.
I would not know.
All right. So a lot of a lot of thoughts are going through my head all at once here. So I have to slow down my brain here a little bit. So for me, I first took an interest in the vibe during my late teens, right? And I was part of the early rave scene in New York City. And I was also going to, let's say, jam bands and concerts, underground clubs, after hours parties, all kinds of stuff, right? And in these scenes, they're kind of like subcultures or counterculture scenes. Everyone was using the word vibe to evaluate the DJ, the bands, the dance floor, whatever the case may be, right? And then from there, though, I realized, well, no one's actually trying to define this thing or explain this thing, and that's why I first took an intellectual interest in the vibe, right? The reason why I'm bringing that up is that for me, in terms of, let's say, group cohesion and the vibe, some of the best experiences or most profound experiences were in terms of like artistic moments, whether it's music, concerts, dance floors, clothes and fashion, right? The whole kind of collective phenomenon, right? And if I just use, let's say, a dance floor, whether it's at a club or a rave or at a concert, and you have hundreds or thousands of people, everyone's listening to the same music, right? Especially very loud music, and kind of literally you feel physical vibrations coming off the speakers hitting your body, right? And we're all kind of in sync with each other, a certain kind of collective rhythm that happens, right, with our bodies, right? And
Mm.
then, at least for me, the way that I'm built with my type of brain, I'm aware of that collective phenomenon and I'm reflective about that collective phenomenon while I'm also inside the collective phenomenon, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah. How does this is going to be a dumb question. How is that not incredibly overwhelming?
Well,
All
it can
that
be.
energy, all those emotions, all those other people, and like, does that not come across?
Well, it does, and I guess the trick is, at least for me and people that do enjoy these kinds of experiences,
Yeah.
is that it becomes kind of a moment of transcendence where you let go of your self-defenses, you let go of your ego, and you give yourself over to the collective experience, right? So it is overwhelming, right? It's so overwhelming though that it helps you actually let go of your ego and just be present in the moment.
Hmm.
Now, I understand. I try to understand though that not everyone will experience that experience like the way I just described it. Right? So as I learn about, let's say, people who are neurodivergent and autistic and on the spectrum, et cetera, like for some people, they don't like that experience. It's too much.
And
Um,
that's kind of where I was going because
right.
it's kind of one of the like because I worked in nightlife for a long time as well, and I always looked at it from an outsider, no matter where I was standing, whether I mean literally I could be the one putting on the event and I did several, or I could be the one hosting the party or whatever have you, but I've never once in all of those years of I started out with college house parties and all this everything because ironically I love being around people. And I mean even public places, malls, airports, most of my friends are afraid to darken the door. I can't wait to go in. So that's kind of the weird way I'm broken.
Right.
And but I never I was always an outsider. I think that's why I got into hosting parties and putting on events is
Right.
because I wasn't really ever a part of what was going on the dance floor. Like, I remember when I was working in nightlife, we were doing sponsored events at this club, and so we were in the VIP section, and it was kind of perfect because I was on a kind of a balcony VIP section, sort of above the milieu below, and for me, it was like the ideal situation. Like this is like for me, like that was like how one experienced this stuff because I could kind of look down at it all happening and people dancing and drumming and grinding and music and all this type of thing. But because I was kind of up and to the left, sort of thing, I was in the building of it happening, but I was not a part of the energy of the people participating in it. And so I find it very interesting that you kind of got to this from that environment as well in a small way. And it's very interesting about the being swept up into the sort of, that collective energy moving on its own as kind of its own entity. I've observed that, but I've never heard it actually spoken about that way. That's
Interesting.
very interesting because I'd kind of presume that must be how it sort of works. But not that I ever experienced it. I read about it and had other people talk about it. And it's interesting that you've now kind of confirmed that again. Um, which I think is very interesting. Um, so I guess then the reverse of that is, um, have you ever felt like an outsider where you weren't part of the vibe?
No, all the time. Like yeah, yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I tend so just based on the way I'm built, right? My psychology and whatnot, I tend to feel like an outsider most of the time, right? Whether it's at work, whether it's at a concert, walking down the street, in a grocery store, that's just how I'm built. Um, that can be for different reasons, though. So what I'm about to say in some ways relates to things you've already said, but from my own personal experience, right?
No, that's good.
So recently, I've come to the conclusion that I'm an empath, and that just means that I feel the world more intensely than other people, right? And then along the same lines, that I'm a quote unquote highly sensitive person, and being an empath and an HSP are basically the same thing. It simply means that our senses are more sensitive, and then we do experience the world uh, more deeply, more through feeling rather than logical and rational thought, etc. Right.
Right.
And with that, though, it kind of resonates with what you were saying earlier. I often come home at the end of the day, even on a good day with good experiences, feeling very exhausted because the world just seems to be very intense for me. Right. It's almost like it's sensory overload. Um, Now, ironically, though, when I go to a concert, or go to a club, or that kind of collective experience, like I said earlier, I'm able to give myself over to it, and it's intense, but I enjoy that intensity as opposed to being in a crowded mall where it's like it's too overwhelming, right? Now, I'm
Yeah.
not comparing my experience with those people who are autistic. I'm not trying to do that at all. I'm saying there are some interesting parallels there, right?
Yeah.
Um, Now, with being an outsider, and I really like your story about like being up on the balcony and watching, I guess it was a club, watching the club happen and whatnot.
Yeah.
I would argue or theorize that although you're experiencing it from uh, from observation, like literally on a deck or higher up and like watching everything, you are still part of the collective vibe, right? So like your body's emanating a vibe, and every all the other bodies on the dance floor are emanating a vibe, and there's no actually empty space between us, right? Instead, your experience of the collective vibe is slightly different than those that you're observing, but you're all part of the same collective phenomenon, right? Just like the door
Well, there's
person
definitely yes, there's
outside,
definitely an aspect of atmosphere, and
right?
there's certainly in those environments, a certain, kind of the whole appeal of it is, there's lots of people who would like to be up here sitting with us. And
Sure, yeah.
I remember I was sitting with one of our models one time and we had the the bottle service set up and all this sort of thing. And it was kind of like that Miranda Priestley moment from The Devil Wears Prada. It's like, there's a lot of people who would like to be sitting up here, sitting next to someone as gorgeous as you, all this type of thing. And tonight, right now, I'm that guy, you know. It's like I'm the one hosting the party. I'm the one responsible to put 2,000 people in this room. And I'm the one sitting here next to a gorgeous Russian girl who barely speaks English, but who's hot as hell, drinking, alcohol that was given to me gratis because I just made this place thousands of dollars. Um, and because my crowd tipped well, so it was never hard for me to find a venue. All this, there's a lot of people who would like to be up here doing this and having this experience right now. And there's more than one person, and I can see them looking up at us because we're part of that whole art. We're in some way this is a bit of a performance,
Yeah.
because they also would like to be, doing this sort of thing. And that was, I think, partly what I found it so when I first got into the industry, what was so alluring. There was a certain amount of glamour and speciality and going in, side doors and being on lists and all this sort of thing that was very, especially I was very young when I did this. I was 23 when I started in the club scene proper. Um and all this sort of thing. It was very alluring, especially at that age. Because especially someone like me, I look like this and I've always looked like this. So for me, even coming out of college, I got a lot of attention from women, all this type of thing. But going into the club scene was a totally different world. And so for me, doing as I did, working at a magazine, being in the clubs, I was getting attention from women who would never pay attention to me in any other circumstance, other than the fact I worked for a magazine who they wanted to be in.
Right.
And that all of a sudden, and that's the Me Too movement. I always left to be kind of like, of course, Hollywood's been predicated on that for decades, sort of thing. Like, yes, that's been the vibe for quite some time, like, sort of thing. And there's a lot of other industries where that's also the vibe of, well, if I hang out with, the ugly oaf, I'll get in this opportunity or whatever have you, will help my career, all this type of thing. Um, and so that was a different sort of in and generated a different sort of attention, but that whole, I guess we'll call it a vibe, was incredibly intoxicating, especially for a young man, not terribly attractive. I've been overweight forever. Um, my fat is old enough to drive. Um, and and all this sort of thing. And it's absolutely intoxicating. And
Well,
incidentally, that's why people usually get into that business, by
sure,
the
of course,
way.
yeah, I would assume so. Yeah, I
Yeah.
like the experience of envisioning like the VIP experience, and I'm privileged enough over my life that I've had VIP experiences before, and that itself is its own vibe, right? Like
Right.
when you're in that VIP area, that section, you get special treatments. You know it, everyone else knows it, and
Right.
generates a certain kind of jealousy, a certain kind of tension, and that's kind of
Yeah.
intoxicating, right? And you start to emanate and radiate a certain kind of energy from you, right? Then you experience that. You like feeling that kind of way. It's like, oh, let me do this again next Friday night, and the next Friday night, and the next Friday nights, right? Then that becomes part of
Yeah.
your identity, right? And so I think that's definitely an experience of the vibe. I don't think there's any doubt about that, right? You get dressed to the nines, you're all decked out, you look hot, you look fashionable, right? You got the bottle service, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that. That's definitely an example of quote unquote the vibe.
No, no, certainly. There was a um I think I mean, even I think in a group setting it's kind of more obvious. Sometimes I find, and I'm interested in what your reaction to this would be. Sometimes I find there can kind of be an overarching vibe because of how something is structured.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. I was working at this company, and how they set up the office was very interesting. All the, well, most of the admin um was upstairs. So it was an HVAC company. The shop, the warehouse, and the parking for the trucks was on one level of the building.
Okay.
And then there was a set of offices upstairs where most of the admin took place. Now,
Okay.
interestingly, the woman who owned the company had her office downstairs. Her son and all the rest of us had offices upstairs. And when I was hired, one of my internal marketing tasks um was to try to get more interaction between upstairs and downstairs sort of
Okay.
thing. And we put in some initiatives to do that, but I kind of sensed literally on like day two, I said, I don't think we're ever going to be able to do that because of how the building's built. the way where we have put people has created, consciously or unconsciously, a class divide between the workers and the manual labor and the executives above. And it was everywhere in the culture of the company. I had never eaten out for lunch on a regular basis. I always packed my own lunch. I'm old fashioned. Um, Sort of thing. And I remember the first week I was there, and it was my first really director level position. I was, had my little lunch box and I'm eating my little lunch at my desk, all this type of thing. And one of the admins, she's like, "You can't do that." And I'm kind of
Wow.
like, why not? It saves money. We live in Seattle. It's expensive to live here. All the time she's like, no, 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 you don't understand. You're executive level. We eat lunch out. Like everyone is going to a place down the road. We
Right.
eat lunch out. That was the last time I brought my lunch because it literally the vibe was we don't eat lunch. We don't bring our own lunch and we don't eat at our desks. We go
Right.
out to lunch somewhere else, all this sort of thing. Um, and of course, me wanting to fit in, being like, well, that's a clear social signal, Cameron, follow along. So, and the company bought lunch on Fridays. So yeah, it was kind of but it was interesting. I'd never really experienced that sort of thing before. But again, we never were able to unify those two groups because literally the way the building was built and where people performed their tasks kind of set the group structure.
Right.
And so what have you ever thought about, that kind of vibe where it's like, yeah, the vibe is that way because of this other structural force or this other thing, and it's gotten expressed in this really funny way. No one will have said anything. The decision would have never been overtly made, but
Mhm.
just because of how the spaces or whatever have you, these things develop. What do you think about all that?
No,
That was a very long monologue to get to a question. Here it is.
I agree with what you're implying 100%, right? So, for instance, how we organize space and objects in space, whether it's literally my desk and a water bottle and some lights, or a massive building, or the Empire State Building, like, uh, famous buildings throughout history, architecture and whatnot, that all plays a certain kind of role. The way that I think about it and the way that I theorize it is that um, architecture in general and the organization of space in general evokes certain kinds of psychological responses, evokes certain kinds of emotional responses, both consciously and subconsciously, and that then affects the vibe or energy that we emanate outward into the world, right? It's kind of like a secondary effect. I'm not sure if the building itself, right, by its very nature of being a brick building, is giving off a vibe or not. But when I enter into that building and my perceptions interact with how that space is organized, it has an effect on my body and this evokes or provokes or invokes, I should say, a different kind of energy from me. And that is often very implicit and very subtle, which then points to another aspect of what you were saying, is that a lot of times the vibe, the collective vibe, is unspoken and subtle, but it still influences us in certain kinds of ways. Right. So you walk into a certain kind of work environment, and without saying anything, without anyone saying anything in particular, you've kind of like, it's like, well, no, this is what we do here. It's not the previous job you've had, right? And you kind of conform to that subtle vibe, or you won't have the job anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like an unspoken
Yeah.
phenomenon,
Well, and this is, I think, where I think where autistic people really struggle, kind of returning to that canard,
right?
really struggle in the employment world is there's a whole bunch of and I work for myself for a reason. Um, there's kind of this all these unspoken rules and social mores,
Mm-hmm.
and we just don't pick them up, and it sucks. And I've heard people in HR overtly say it's easier to fix an employee with no skills than it is with one who's hard to get along with. And I understand that a lot of autistic will give off mad, uncanny valley vibes that are very uncomfortable. And I think it does become the everything was fine here before they showed up.
Interesting.
Because we're trying to solve problems, trying to do real work. We're saying things that are unsaid. We're exposing all of that stuff that's sort of been swept under the rug. And that's not a fast way to make friends influence people.
No, no.
Yeah. And I think that's where and, I mean even those of us that really try, I still stick my foot in it. Like, I'm working with a company now who's also my book publisher. This is the first time, and I don't know what's different about this place other than I have deep suspicion that the man who runs it's also autistic. And frankly, so does he after meeting me. That conversation has been had. The first time where I don't feel like that's not the vibe. Like I
Mm.
don't feel like I've been with them a whole year now, and I don't feel like I've, interrupted some great social thing, or I've, committed some terrible faux pas or all this type of thing. And not that there haven't been struggles and difficulties, but we've been able to have very frank and direct communication, and it's been much more successful. I wish they paid a little bit better, but we'll take what we can get. Um and so it's yeah, I think that is a big struggle. So it's quite impressive, I think, to be able to here's what's sad. It's incredibly common, but to me, it seems so impressive to be able to pick up on all that stuff and those vibes
Mm.
without a word being said. That's
Now, based
magical
on
as far as I'm
what
concerned. Might as well be witchcraft.
this, I appreciate that. I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it, right? I take it for granted, just kind of how I'm built, and I've been studying it for so long. But
Right.
based on some of the things you're sharing there, I think it's interesting. I've never thought about this before, but do neurotypical people give off a certain kind of vibe, and do neurodivergent people give off a certain kind of vibe, right? And then
Mm.
when you have a group of neurotypical people, do they emanate a certain kind of collective vibe, as opposed to a group of neurodivergent people that would give off or emanate a different kind of vibe? And I don't know. I've never thought about that till now, but I think it's fascinating to think about. And so if we talk about someone who's autistic walking into, let's say, a neurotypical environment, the vibes may not be gelling. It's a different kind of vibe, right? It's not just brain chemistry and not just neurology, but also this thing that we call the vibe. If every person is giving off a vibe and we're all different, we're all giving off different kinds of vibes. But on a social scale, we have social systems, we have social structures, we have social norms, we have socio-normative behavior, right? And that usually revolves around those who are in power, right? So in
Right.
this case, I mean, not to be too controversial, I'm not sure what your listeners are into, but with America,
We do politics in the news. Go right on ahead.
we tend to privilege uh, straight, white, cis, male people who are wealthy with money, right? And the entire system revolves around their wants, their needs, their views, and that itself is its own vibe, right? And if you don't gel with that vibe, then you're the outcasts, you're the marginalized, you're the excluded, right? So the question is, how do we elevate these other kinds of vibes to challenge and combat this kind of overprivileged socio-normative expectations?
Yes. No, and I think, I mean, I can also, say, a I think many neurotypicals would be very surprised at what happens when there are a group of neurodivergent people together. It's a
Interesting.
very different experience.
Okay.
Very, very different experience. Um, than than the kind of the ordinary neurotypical situation. I also find this a big difference between straight and queer communities.
Oh, sure. Yeah, totally.
And especially in queer communities, you'll also find a lot of neurodivergence as well. So I think a lot of those quirky things are more normalized. They kind of expect you to be a bit odd, sort of thing. And odd people tend to be about, so it raises much less of a fuss. Um, than in other environments where it kind of
Right.
raises more of a fuss. And the other big one, and there's a big difference, and I enjoyed this one. A lot of comedians make fun of it, is the difference in if there's a group of only black people versus like when white people arrive. And I'm like biracial, so I kind of live on the bridge between those worlds. And I always joke, and I'm kind of like, if the white people only knew the things that we say when they aren't around, like, um, because yeah, I mean, and it's something where the mood shift is so pronounced, even I notice it. Like when the racial dynamics, and it even is like with other brown people. Like you can have a group that's like black, Hispanics, maybe some other immigrant group, all this type of thing, and then someone who's white comes in, the vibe shift is palpable, you
Sure.
know.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and and that has a lot to do with how we deal with race and racial groups in
Sure.
this country and all this type of thing. Um, And I think that stuff I find endlessly fascinating. So
And on that note, so I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase like of space, like a white space, black spaces, queer spaces, straight
you
spaces,
get this
right?
in a lot of social activism, is this a
Right,
black centered space?
right,
Or you'll get the whole thing of if there's too many white people at the Black Lives Matter protest, like this is supposed to, but the whiteness is still centered
right. Yep.
sort of thing. Yeah, that's,
And then I
can
would
be
invite your
tricky.
listeners to view that those concepts of white spaces, black spaces, queer spaces through the lens of the vibe, right? So it's not just what we're seeing with our eyes, right? Or, the hand gestures and the nonverbals and the linguistic cues. That's all part of that. But there's also this subtle thing of energy, this subtle thing of a collective mood or a collective vibe that's happening that's constitutive of those spaces, right? So again, I think we could apply this vibe terminology to this analysis of different kinds of spaces and which spaces are inviting, which spaces are not inviting, which spaces are inclusive or exclusive, and so on.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there's also, even within, I think even different, groups of people, and this is kind of where identity doesn't matter, but it also kind of does, because when people find out things about you, their attitude towards you changes, and that's a vibe shift,
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally.
You find this a lot, especially in, gay male spaces. And this
Sure.
is also true in the Black community. Like, if among gay men, if you're very, masculine and straight appearing, your experience of gayness and queerness is very different than those of
Mhm.
us who it's a little bit more obviously gay. The same thing in the Black community, with between, there's been whole books written
Yeah,
about, passing and all this type of thing. And that's something I have personal experience with. I tend to be able to get away with a lot of stuff that someone of a darker skin tone cannot. Um and my father's about as dark as this microphone. So I know it, I can see it, I get it, I've had it explode, all this sort of thing. Um and it's also, I think, sometimes, magical to watch white privilege at work when I, am around people. And I just kind of, I have a writing partner who I'm just kind of like, oh my God, how can you do some of this stuff? And he's like, Cameron, I'm a middle-aged straight white male. I get away with so much shit.
yeah,
And I'm
yeah,
like, true, you're right, you're right. Like I lived my whole life around the brown the brown skin sort of thing. That especially comes into focus in like interracial relationships. Like I remember I was with someone and we got pulled over by the cops and she's like, whoa, I've never seen you be like that, act like that, handle a situation that way. I'm like, well, I'm trying not to get shot. So
yeah,
there's a protocol sort of
yeah.
thing. And she's like, I've never ever been afraid of being pulled over or afraid of the police or anything like all this other things. I said, well, they're not shooting you, so
Right.
of course you wouldn't, sort of thing. But yeah, like there was a vibe shift. Like, yeah, we're getting pulled over. Yeah, the cop is walking up. Let's try to not make this a deadly occasion, sort of thing. Um, that's its own vibe shift, but it's anyway. That didn't end with a question, and I apologize. And we're coming up to the hour, so I'm gonna do this for you. Why don't you give us some final thoughts on this, and then tell us where we can find you online and keep track of you?
Sure. One of the things I always invite people to do is for the next week or so, pay attention to how many times you use the word vibe or some variation of the word, right? And how often you hear other people talk about the vibe. And I would assume once you kind of set your gaze on this word and this phenomenon, you will realize that lots of people, including yourself, talk about the vibe on a regular basis. And then from
Mm,
there, though, ask yourself, like, in what way are they using it? uh how what's the word actually mean when they use it? What kind of experience are they talking about? And then from there, how can you individually flesh out your understanding of the vibe? And I say that because I'm trying to invite people to, again, make their experience into an idea, and then once it's an idea, you have more control over it, and you can start to think about it in deeper kinds of ways. If you're interested in these ideas about the vibe and whatnot, you go to my website, which is 20minutevibe.com. Again, 20minutevibe.com. And it's basically offering up vibe content for people who are intellectually curious, right? I have essays up there, short videos. I have self-paced video courses you can look at, right? Anything from 1 hour to 2 hours, things like that. And again, it's trying to be an inviting space to help people articulate their experience and their understanding of this thing we call the vibe.
Excellent, excellent. Well, this has been a good conversation, although I fear I talk too much, but thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
I appreciate it. I had a lot of fun.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.